Charles Travis, and I would like to thank Aaron and Keela for inviting me to participate in this session. My talk is based upon a paper I published in Historical Geography, Reterritorializing Frederick Jackson Turner's Rhetorical Cartography. Frederick Jackson Turner's essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, has been described as a classic essay in speculative historical geography. This talk argues that his essay is a powerful piece of aspirational rhetorical cartography that recycled the dramatic and romantic tropes of the early American frontier literature, rather than documenting the messy and often entangled histories of U.S. industrial and settler expansion over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. This paper will juxtapose a map of the settings of frontier literature with the locations described in Turner's essays. So, this paper will discuss 4 types of representations of the American frontier. Literary frontiers, the U.S. Census's statistical frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier, and what I call manufacturing or organic industrial frontiers. Literary frontiers. So, this map represents the dates and frontier settings of 59 selected representative pieces of American frontier literature, comprised mostly of novels, but also religious tracts, biographical accounts, drama, and poetry published between 1697 and 1885. And as we can see, there are these clusters that occur largely in the Ohio and Mississippi river valleys, and there are outliers. And while we can consider classic American frontier literature sort of a cultural production of a higher sort, there, of course, after this was established, the mass manufacture of literature such as Beatles' dime novels, which kick-started the proliferation of cheap paper publications possessing lurid covers and illustrations containing stories of conflict between good and evil across the landscape of America's perceived new Western frontiers. The historian Richard White argues that Turner's narrative of the U.S. national journey from log cabins to finished farms was modeled on the chronicles of progress featured in Midwestern mug books. The second representation of the frontier I'll discuss is the U.S. Census's statistical frontier. The frontier is a statistic. The first representation of the frontier line in the U.S. Census came in the 9th U.S. Census of 1870. This was managed by Census Superintendent Francis A. Walker, who wrote in Harper's Weekly that the Star of Empire, its course is still westward. However, Walker's representation of the tallies erased the presence of manufacture, as well as cities. And this was despite the cities were becoming some of the most dynamic places and assemblages in the country in many ways. In many ways, Walker's aim was to present sort of an agrarian, Jeffersonian picture of America and its frontier and its identity, eluding the presence of cities and growing immigration, which was occurring. And the thing that's curious about this is that many of the maps from the census were published in school books, providing a geographical image for many school students and teachers. The statistical frontier was first established in the U.S. Census of 1880 by Henry Gannett. and for him the frontier line was merely a statistical model, which he applied to exclude regions having less than 2 inhabitants to a square mile. And Gannett can be lauded as the father of American map making, really bringing statistical cartography into play in the representation of the U.S. Census. The nullified frontier, the 11th census of 1890. This is the census that Turner based his essay on. And tabulating results and mapping them, Henry Gannett concluded that up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier settlement, but at present the unsettled area has been so broken into isolated bodies that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. The 1890 census also included a questionnaire that asked citizens to identify by ethnicity and skin color. And these racial classifications were preoccupations of the post-emancipation Jim Crow South. The census also took place the year of the Wounded Knee Massacre at the Pine Ridge Reservation, but ironically was the first to tally all classes of quote-unquote Indians. Gannett based his calculation of the absence of a frontier solely on the western division of the U.S. Census, this region of the country. Ironically, if you look at the entire 1890 U.S. population, if you map it out, you can see that there are areas that were either not counted, which was called quote-unquote Indian territory, where actually there was statistically a frontier that existed here. And this is ironic because it's sort of in Turner's backyard, that statistically there was still a frontier even though Gannett had claimed that there wasn't one. So Frederick Jackson's frontier. We can see that Turner's 1893 essay anticipated the landscape as text heuristic of late 20th century cultural geography, as evinced not only in this painting by John Gass, which illustrates Turner's poetic language, that the United States lies like a huge page in the history of society, line by line. We read this continental page from east to west. This echoed tropes from American frontier literature. Turner rhetorically spatialized the westward direction of the frontier line by curating dioramic histories of its successive waves, giving each a title. The Indian traders, followed by the ranchers, followed by the farmers, and army posts and salt springs. Diorama history was defined by Paul Carter in The Road to Botany Bay, an exploration of landscape and history, is that narratives of the past have been settled even more effectively than the country, and that history continues to unfold upon the stage while nullifying time's cultural peculiarities. So these different waves of Turner's that he had in his essay sort of created these frozen moments that he felt encapsulated the expansion of the United States into sort of a mythical origin story. This is the context of the 1890 U.S. Census and the lower 40 states county names origin. And so the historical, political, geographical context of Turner's thesis reflects the emerging dominance of English or Anglo-Saxon and Scots-Irish Presbyterian place naming at a county level in the latter half of the 19th century. Derek Alderman argues that place naming represents a mean of claiming the landscape materially and symbolically, and using its power to privilege one worldview over another, contending that place names not only meld history and geography, but also conflate place and group identity. And so while these counties were being named, Turner's essay seemed to reflect the expansion and historical origin myth of the United States. And this is the context in which he penned his 1893 essay. If we map out his rhetorical cartography, we find that a reading and analysis and mapping of the significance of the frontier identified 85 georeferences to historical figures, works, and events that primarily cluster in the eastern region of the continent, where frontier settlements were established in the colonial and early Republican periods. And these patterns adhere to Turner's primary research focus on it when he did his PhD on the areas of Thomas Jefferson, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. If we compare the locations of these place names in Turner's essay with the locations of frontier literature, we find correlations in the Ohio Valley. Ronald Beck, in a 1955 study, claimed that there might be some use. My own speculation concerns the presence of a manufacturing or organic industrial frontier. The U.S. Census of 1900 revealed that the frontier had statistically returned, principally in the western states. And this occurred, I believe, because of the expansion of urbanism, particularly the growth of these manufacturing cities in Denver, Salt Lake, Eastern Washington, Western Washington, San Francisco, Los Angeles. People were drawn to these cities, these manufacturing bases, and the most densely populated areas show the greatest products of manufacturers per square mile. So there was a correlation between manufacturing and industry. This map is a map taken from the 1900 census based upon manufacturing data. And Henry Gannett, who tabulated these figures, stated as similar maps have not been prepared for previous censuses, it is possible to compare what might be termed the advance of the frontier line of manufacturers, but is estimated by the movement of the center of manufacturers. This line has progressed south and west since 1850 from its early home in New England and the Middle States. So my current project now is I am going back and trying to find proxy data to map the presence of this manufacturing or organic industrial frontier prior to 1900 by looking at proxy data not only in previous censuses but also in other types of archival resources. And so this brings me to my conclusion, this idea of frontiers. So I've defined 4 different types of frontiers in regards to the expansion of the United States over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. And now we see this trope of the frontier being recycled along the southern border in the current political atmosphere of this country. And this idea that the frontier, one person's frontier is another person's homeland. And one of the things that I'm working on is to think about this borderland region. And one of the thinkers or poets that inspires me and helps me think about this region is Gloria Azaldúa, who lamented in her poetry about the borderlands, calling it una herida abierta, an open wound, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds, and before a scab forms and hemorrhages again, the lifeblood of 2 worlds emerging to form a third country, a border culture. And so my entire sort of argument about the manufacturing frontier and Turner's frontier is that what was really occurring with European settlement was an industrial manufacturing frontier that was expanding against a hunting, gathering, agrarian culture. And it's a different way to think about this idea of what frontier means and what frontier definitions are. So I thank you very much for having me in the session.